In 1966, the United States Army sent thousands of young men into a jungle with a brand new rifle and no cleaning kit. Not because the kits were delayed, because somebody had decided they were not necessary. The rifle had been described in writing as self-cleaning. That phrase appears in the promotional language around the weapon in the early years, and it made its way into the expectations of the men who were handed one and told very little else. Some of them arrived in country with a rifle they had fired a handful of times, no brush, no rod, no solvent, and no instruction beyond the assurance that this one did not need any of that. It needed all of that. Tonight, we are going to take that rifle apart slowly and find out exactly how a good design arrived in a war unfinished. Not sabotaged, not cursed, unfinished in the specific and much duller way that things get unfinished inside large organizations. A decision here, a substitution there, a test that was not run, a paragraph removed from a manual, each one defensible on its own, and all of them landing at the same time, on the same young man, in the same wet place. We will go through the powder that was changed, and why that mattered more than anything else. The chamber that was not plated, the gas system that was doing something quietly clever and therefore quietly fragile, the letters that went home, the committee that read them, and the fixes that arrived eventually and worked. There is nothing here you need to remember in the morning. If you fall asleep before we get to the committee will still be sitting there tomorrow night, and so will I. One small thing before we begin, and then I will not interrupt you again. Tap the like button and subscribe while you are still awake enough to do it. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read every one of them. It helps this channel more than you would think. Thank you. Now, put the phone down and let your shoulders come away from your ears. We will start with the rifle that came before. The weapon the American infantrymen carried into the early 1960s was the M16. It fired a full-power cartridge, the 7.62 by 51 millimeter round, and it was, by every technical standard of the previous war, an excellent rifle. Accurate at distance, powerful, built out of wood and steel by people who understood wood and steel. It also weighed a great deal, and its ammunition weighed more. A soldier can carry a certain amount of weight, and that number does not change because the rifle is good. It is fixed by his body and by the distance he has to walk. So every ounce in the rifle and every ounce in each cartridge comes out of something else, or comes out of the number of rounds he can carry, or comes out of him. In a European war, fought across open ground at long range with vehicles nearby and supply lines behind, the M16 made complete sense. That is the war it was designed for, by people who had fought the last one and were preparing for the next one in the same place. The war that actually arrived was in a different climate, at a different range, on foot. In dense vegetation, the distances at which men actually shoot at each other collapse. The long-range accuracy that justified the heavy cartridge stops being the thing that decides anything. What decides things is how fast a man can get rounds into a small area, how many rounds he is carrying when the contact starts, and whether he can handle the weapon in a space where he cannot fully extend his arms. The M16 was also difficult to control when fired automatically. The recoil of that cartridge in a rifle of that weight walks the muzzle upward fast. In practice, most M14s in service were set to fire one round at a time, because a man firing bursts was mostly rearranging the treetops. None of this made the M16 a bad rifle. It made it the right answer to a question nobody was being asked anymore. That is the beginning of the story, and it is the least dramatic beginning imaginable. There is no villain in it. There is only an institution that had built exactly what it had been told to build, and a world that had quietly changed the requirements while nobody was looking. Now, let us meet the man who had been thinking about a different question entirely. Eugene Stoner was a designer at a small company called Armalite, which was a division of an aircraft firm, and that detail matters more than anything else you will hear tonight. Because Stoner did not think about rifles the way the ordnance establishment thought about rifles. He thought about them the way an aircraft engineer thinks about a structure. What is this part actually doing? What is the lightest material that can do it? And how do I get the loads to travel through the geometry instead of through mass? So he built a rifle out of aluminum and plastic. Take a moment with how that landed in 1958. The people evaluating this thing had spent their careers around walnut stocks and forged steel receivers. A rifle whose stock was a synthetic and whose receiver was aluminum alloy did not look serious. It looked like a toy. Men who picked one up for the first time said exactly that, in exactly those words, for years. It was also astonishingly light. The design he arrived at, the AR-15, weighed a fraction less than 7 pounds without a magazine, against something in the region of 9.5 for the loaded M4A, and its cartridge, a small high-velocity round of about 5.56 millimeters, weighed roughly a third of what the big round weighed. Do that arithmetic across a full combat load, and the result is not an improvement. It is a different category of thing. The same weight of ammunition that gave a man 100 rounds of the heavy cartridge gave him nearly 300 of the small one. For a rifleman on foot, in vegetation, in a fight that will be decided in the first 30 seconds at 40 meters, 300 rounds is not a marginal advantage. And the small cartridge, fired from a rifle of that weight, was controllable on automatic in a way the M14 never was. A man could actually hold the burst on a target rather than on the sky above it. Stoner also did something inside the rifle that we need to look at carefully, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Every self-loading rifle has to solve the same problem. How do you use some of the energy from firing one round to eject the case and load the next one? The traditional answer used in most designs of that era is to tap some gas out of the barrel, push it against a piston, and let the piston shove the bolt carrier backward. The gas stays in a separate tube. The mechanism is a machine with an intermediate part. Stoner did away with the piston. In his design, the gas comes out of a port in the barrel, travels back through a thin steel tube, and enters the bolt carrier directly, where it expands inside a small chamber and pushes the carrier back against the bolt itself. The bolt carrier and the bolt become their own piston and cylinder. There is no separate part in between. The advantages are real, and they are exactly what an aircraft engineer would care about. Fewer parts, less weight, less mass moving off the axis of the barrel, which means the rifle stays on target better during automatic fire. And the operating forces travel straight down the center line rather than being applied off to one side by a piston rod. The cost is equally real, and it is the whole rest of tonight. The gas that operates the rifle is combustion gas, straight from the barrel, carrying whatever the burning propellant leaves behind. And in this design, that gas is delivered directly into the heart of the mechanism, into the space where the bolt sits, at the exact place where precise tolerances matter most. In a piston design, the residue stays out front. In the gas block, in a part you can scrub, away from the moving components that must fit each other closely. In this design, the residue goes where the rifle lives. Stoner knew this. He designed around it, and the specific way he designed around it involved an assumption about what the propellant would be. That assumption is where this comes apart. But we will get there, and we are in no hurry. The Army did not want the rifle. That sentence needs to be said carefully, because the version of this story that circulates online turns it into a conspiracy, and the truth is both more ordinary and more interesting. The organization responsible for small arms development in the United States Army at that time had a long institutional history, a considerable amount of expertise, and a settled view about what an infantry rifle was. It had spent years developing the M16 and had only just fielded it. It had an established doctrine built around the full-power cartridge and around marksmanship at distance. Along came an outside design from a small company in materials the establishment did not respect, firing a cartridge the establishment considered inadequate, promoted by people who were not part of the establishment. You do not need malice to predict the outcome. Any large organization presented with an outside solution that implies its own recent decision was wrong will respond the way this one did. Slowly, with tests, and with a great many objections that are individually reasonable. There were real technical objections, too, and some of them were correct. Questions about the effectiveness of the small cartridge at longer ranges, questions about penetration, questions about how the aluminum and plastic construction would hold up to abuse. Those were legitimate engineering concerns raised by people whose job was to raise them. There was also a series of comparative tests during those years whose conduct was later criticized, and criticized specifically by the congressional investigation we will come to, on the grounds that the testing had not been even-handed. I'm going to leave that there rather than characterize it further, because the details of who ran which test in which year and with what result is precisely the kind of thing where a confident sentence in a video becomes a wrong sentence forever. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The Army was not adopting it, and then the Air Force did. The United States Air Force needed a weapon for the men who guarded its bases and its aircraft. Their requirement was completely different from an infantry requirement: light, easy to shoot, effective at short range, easy to train people on who were not full-time riflemen. The AR-15 was very nearly a perfect answer to that specific question, and the Air Force's leadership at the time, which was in the hands of a man not known for patience with other services' opinions, moved to buy it. So the rifle entered American service through a side door, purchased by an Air Force for guarding gates, while the Army that would eventually carry it into a jungle was still explaining why it did not want one. That is a strange route for a service rifle to take, and it is the first structural reason this story ends the way it does. A weapon that enters an organization sideways does not arrive with the full apparatus that normally comes with adoption: the doctrine, the manuals, the training pipeline, the maintenance system, the logistics of spare parts. All of that gets built for a weapon the institution has decided to own. This one arrived as somebody else's purchase. Then the war began to expand, and the requirement changed shape overnight. By the middle of the 1960s, American units were deploying in numbers into exactly the environment where the heavy rifle was worst and the light rifle was best. The advisors who had seen the AR-15 in the hands of Vietnamese troops, who are smaller framed on average, and for whom the M14 was genuinely too much rifle, had been writing enthusiastic reports for years. And the decision came down. The new rifle would be the general issue weapon. The scale of that decision is the thing to hold on to. This was not a trial batch. This was a plan to put a rifle that had entered service sideways, without the full institutional apparatus behind it, into the hands of hundreds of thousands of men in a hurry, in the worst climate on earth, for a mechanism with tight tolerances. Everything that follows tonight comes out of the collision between that timeline and that rifle. Now we come to the powder, and this is the center of the whole story, so let us take it slowly. A cartridge is a small controlled explosion in a metal cup, and the propellant inside it is not a generic substance. There are families of propellants with very different behaviors, and the choice among them affects almost everything about how a firearm operates. Stoner had developed his rifle around one particular type, an extruded propellant of the family designated IMR, which burns in a specific way and produces a specific pressure curve and a specific amount of residue. The gas system we described earlier is tuned to that curve. The port in the barrel is a certain size, in a certain place, because of when and how much pressure will be available at that point. The mass of the bolt carrier and the strength of the springs are matched to it. The whole mechanism is a set of parts balanced against an expected behavior. Change the propellant, and you change every one of those relationships at once. And the propellant was changed. The ammunition that was procured in quantity for the new rifle used a different type, a ball propellant, a spherical powder, of the family designated WC. There were reasons for that choice, and they were the kind of reasons that are entirely sensible from an ammunition production standpoint. Ball propellant was made in large quantities by established suppliers. It had advantages in manufacture, in bulk handling, in cost, and in the ability to meet enormous demand quickly, which was very much the situation. From the point of view of the people responsible for producing hundreds of millions of cartridges in a hurry, it was a reasonable substitution. From the point of view of the mechanism, it was not a substitution at all. It was a different machine. Here is what actually changes, and this is the engineering heart of tonight. The ball propellant burned differently, and the effect at the gas port was to deliver more pressure for longer. The rifle cycle sped up. The rate at which it fired on automatic went up beyond what the design intended, which sounds like a trivial specification and is not, because every timing relationship inside a self-loading rifle depends on things happening in the right order with enough time. When the carrier moves faster, the extraction of the fired case begins earlier, while pressure in the chamber is still higher than it should be. The case is being pulled out of a chamber it is still pressed hard against. That is the first problem, and by itself it would have been survivable. The second problem is residue. The ball propellant left more fouling behind, and the fouling was of a different character. And because of the design we discussed earlier, that fouling did not stay out in a gas block where a man could reach it with a brush. It came straight down the tube and into the bolt carrier, into the gas rings, into the recesses of the bolt, into precisely the places where the rifle needs to be clean. Fouling accumulates. It accumulates faster than anyone had planned for, because nobody had planned for this powder in this rifle. And as it accumulates, it interferes with the very timing that the faster cycle had already disturbed. Two problems, arriving from the same decision, working on each other, and now add the third, which is where the climate comes in. The chamber of a rifle is the short section of the barrel where the cartridge sits when it fires. It is a precision surface, and it is the surface against which the brass case expands under enormous pressure, and from which the case must then be pulled cleanly. If that surface is pitted or corroded or roughened in any way, the case does not release cleanly. It grips. The early rifles did not have a chrome-lined chamber. Chrome plating a chamber and a bore is an old idea and a well-understood one. It resists corrosion, it is harder, and it releases a case more easily. It costs money and adds a manufacturing step. And in a temperate climate, with a rifle that is regularly maintained, you can make a defensible argument for leaving it out. Now put that rifle in a place where the air is saturated with moisture for months at a time, where the weapon is carried in rain and set down in mud and never fully dries, and where the man carrying it may or may not have a cleaning kit. Steel in that environment does what steel does. It begins to corrode in hours, not weeks, and the corrosion appears exactly where it is least welcome, which is inside the chamber, on the surface that must let go of the case. 3 things, then, all at once. A faster cycle pulling the case earlier than intended, more fouling arriving in the worst place, and a chamber surface that grips instead of releasing. Every one of them attacks the same moment in the rifle's cycle, the moment of extraction. And when extraction fails, this is what actually happens, and I want to describe it precisely, because the phrase failure to extract sounds like a nuisance, and it is not. The rifle fires. The bolt begins to move back, pulling on the rim of the case with a small hooked claw called the extractor. The case is stuck. The claw is pulling on the rim of a case that is not coming. Something has to give. What gives is the rim. The extractor tears through the metal at the edge of the case and slips off, and the bolt carries on backward without the case, and the next round comes up out of the magazine and is driven forward into the back of a case that is still sitting in the chamber. The rifle is now jammed in the worst possible way, not a misfeed you can clear by pulling the handle. There is a spent case wedged in the chamber, and the only way to get it out is to push it out from the front, down the barrel, with a rod. Which brings us to the cleaning rod, and to the reason that cleaning rods became, briefly, the most valuable object in some units in that war. A sectional cleaning rod, assembled, run down the muzzle and struck against the stuck case to drive it backward out of the chamber. Then reload and continue. That is not a field expedient in the ordinary sense. It is a procedure that takes both hands, requires the rifle to be taken out of action entirely, requires a specific piece of equipment, and takes time measured in tens of seconds at best. Now hold that image, and let us put you inside it for a moment, because the numbers do not mean anything until you are standing in them. You are 19. It is early afternoon, and the light is coming down through the canopy in pieces. You have been walking since before dawn, and your uniform has not been dry since you got here. The contact starts the way they always start, which is to say instantly, and from a direction nobody expected. Everyone is on the ground. There is an enormous amount of noise, and none of it is organized. You fire. 2 rounds, maybe 5, and then your rifle stops. There is no bang and no recoil, only a small dead click, and your hand is already moving to the charging handle, because you have practiced this 100 times. You pull it back. It does not come. You pull harder. It moves an inch and stops against something that will not yield, and you can feel through the metal that there is something wrong in there in a way that pulling will not fix. Now you are lying on the ground in the middle of a firefight, holding 7 pounds of aluminum and plastic that has become, for the moment, an oddly shaped stick. And here is the part that the men who were there describe with the most feeling, half a century later. Not fear exactly, something closer to disbelief, the specific sensation of having been let down by an object at the exact moment the object had one job. Some of them reached for the cleaning rod. Some of them did not have one. Some of them had to ask the man beside them, in the middle of all that, whether he had one, which is a conversation nobody should ever have to have. That is the failure, not a statistic. That. Let us come back out of it and breathe for a second. Everything on your side of the screen is fine. Nothing in your dark requires anything from you tonight. We are only looking at this from a long way away. Slowly, the way you look at something in a museum case. Back to the machine. There is another element in the timing problem, and it is the buffer, which is the part almost nobody outside the subject has heard of, and which turned out to matter enormously. At the back of the rifle, inside the stock, there is a tube containing a spring and a weight. The bolt carrier travels back into that tube, compresses the spring, and is pushed forward again. The weight in that assembly is called the buffer, and it does exactly what the name suggests. It moderates the movement. If the carrier is traveling faster than intended, because the propellant is producing more push than intended, the whole cycle happens sooner than it should. The bolt returns forward while the magazine spring is still lifting the next round into position, and the timing that the designer balanced so carefully begins to slip. One of the fixes that eventually came was a redesigned buffer, heavier and constructed differently inside, which slowed the cycle back down toward where it was supposed to be. It is a small metal cylinder. It cost very little, and it is a good illustration of the shape of this entire story, because the problem was never that anybody had built something stupid. The problem was that a set of carefully balanced relationships had been disturbed by a decision made in a different building, for reasons that were perfectly sound in that building, by people who did not know what the change would do at the other end of the chain. That is how most institutional failures actually happen. Not with a villain, with a memo. Now, the manual, or rather, the absence of one. Every weapon that enters service comes with a body of written material. How it works, how to maintain it, what to do when it does not. That material is produced by the institution that adopts the weapon, distributed through its training system, and taught to the men who will carry it. The rifle we are discussing arrived faster than that apparatus could be built, and it arrived carrying a reputation that actively worked against building it, because somewhere in the promotion of the design, in the enthusiasm of the people selling it and the people advocating for it, the idea had taken hold that this rifle required less maintenance than its predecessors. In some of the language around it, that became the claim that it was self-cleaning. No firearm is self-cleaning. That is not a thing that exists. What was probably meant originally was something narrower and defensible about the design, requiring less frequent attention under normal conditions than certain other weapons. By the time it reached a 19-year-old in a replacement depot, it had become a sentence. You do not need to clean this one much. So men who had been trained on the M16, where cleaning was a religion enforced by sergeants, were handed a new rifle and told, in effect, to relax about it, in the wettest place any of them had ever been. The cleaning kits were the practical expression of that failure. Early on, they were not issued in anything like the numbers needed. Units improvised, men shared. Rods and brushes and solvent were requested from home in letters, which is a detail I find genuinely difficult to sit with. American families, in 1967 buying gun cleaning supplies at a hardware store and mailing them to a war because the supply system had not sent enough. That happened. It is one of the better documented parts of this story, and it is the point at which the men themselves became the ones fixing the problem. Let us stay with the men for a while, because the next part of this belongs to them and not to any committee. Before we do, one small piece of vocabulary, because it will make the rest clearer. The rifle you have been picturing all night probably has a specific designation in your head, and the designations in this story moved around a good deal, which is a small thing that causes a large amount of confusion. The original design carried the maker's own model number. The Air Force purchase carried one military designation. The Army's version, ordered while the weapon was still formally an experimental item, carried an experimental prefix. And the version with all of the early modifications, including the forward assist, eventually became the designation that most people remember. I am not going to recite the letter and number combinations, partly because they are dull to listen to at this hour, and partly because getting one of them slightly wrong is precisely the sort of error that a viewer who knows the subject will notice immediately and never forgive. What matters is the shape. The weapon that went into the bad years was, in the paperwork, still partly an experimental item being fielded at enormous scale, which is a sentence that should worry anybody who has ever worked inside a large organization. An experimental designation is not a formality. It signals that a thing is not finished, and a thing that is not finished is a thing whose manuals, spare parts pipeline, training program, and maintenance doctrine are also, by definition, not finished. The paperwork was telling the truth the whole time. Nobody was reading it. There is a particular thing that happens when a large number of people all encounter the same problem independently, and then discover that everyone else has it too. At first, each man assumes it is him. He assumes he did something wrong, that he did not clean it properly, that he loaded it badly, that he is the only one. That is how people are, and it is especially how 19-year-olds are in an organization that has spent months telling them that failures are personal. Then he talks to the man beside him, and then the whole unit knows, and then units talk to each other, and within a remarkably short time, there is a shared body of knowledge inside that army about a problem that officially did not exist. The men developed practices, not from a manual, because there was not one that addressed this, from each other. They cleaned obsessively, whenever there was any opportunity at all, which is exactly the opposite of what they had been told they would need to do. They cleaned at halts. They cleaned before dark. They cleaned in the rain, which sounds absurd, and was done anyway, with a poncho held over the work. They kept the rifle out of the mud with a discipline that men who carried other weapons found excessive. Muzzle up, muzzle covered, a plastic bag, or a condom over the muzzle to keep water out of the bore, which is one of those field expedients that appears in every account of that war, and that was, in strict engineering terms, entirely correct. They loaded 18 or 19 rounds into a magazine designed for 20, because a fully compressed magazine spring is a magazine spring that may not lift the last rounds with authority, and because when your rifle is already fighting you on timing, you take every margin you can get. They carried a cleaning rod where they could reach it, taped to the stock or to the harness, which tells you everything about what they expected to happen, and a certain number of them went looking for something else to carry entirely. There were men in that war who held on to an M16 as long as they could get away with it. There were units where the older weapon persisted well past the point where it was supposed to have been replaced, because somebody senior had decided that whatever the paperwork said, his men were keeping what worked. There were men who carried a shotgun. There were men who liked the enemy's rifle and said so out loud, which is a difficult thing for a soldier to say about the weapon on the other side, and which a number of them said anyway in those specific years. Not because it was more accurate, because it was not. Because it was famously indifferent to dirt. That comparison deserves a moment, because it gets thrown around carelessly. The rifle the other side carried was built on a completely different philosophy. Loose tolerances, generous clearances, a long stroke piston system with plenty of energy and plenty of room for fouling to exist without stopping anything. It was heavier. It was less accurate. Its sights were cruder. At 200 meters, it was not in the same conversation, but it ran. Full of mud, full of water, uncleaned for weeks, it ran. Both designs are correct. They are correct for different priorities, and each one pays for what it buys. The design with the tighter tolerances buys accuracy and control and lightness, and pays for it with a demand for maintenance. The design with the loose tolerances buys indifference to conditions, and pays for it with weight and precision. If you know that trade, you can choose which one you want. The men in 1966 and 1967 had not been told there was a trade. That is the actual grievance when you strip away the anger and the folklore, not that they had been given a delicate rifle. Soldiers will carry a delicate thing and look after it, and take a certain pride in doing so if you tell them that is what it is. They had been given a delicate rifle and told it was a robust one. There is one more environmental detail that belongs here, and it is the one that surprises people who have never carried a weapon in that kind of country. Dust and rain are not the only enemies of a mechanism. Vegetation is. A rifle carried through dense growth collects material constantly. Seeds, fragments of leaf, fine plant fiber, the kind of debris that is too small to notice and exactly the right size to sit in a recess. It gets into the ejection port, which is an open rectangular hole in the side of the receiver leading directly to the bolt. The design has a spring-loaded dust cover over that port, and it works well, and it is open the moment the rifle is fired, and stays open until somebody closes it. It gets into the magazine well. It gets under the extractor. It gets into the gap around the charging handle. Add moisture, and that plant material becomes a paste. Add the carbon fouling we have already discussed, and the paste becomes a compound with genuinely impressive adhesive properties. The men learn to look for it, and to blow it out, and to close the dust cover reflexively every time they finished shooting, which is a habit that survives in that family of rifles to this day, and which most people who own one have never thought about the origin of. It is another small example of the same lesson. The rifle was not fragile. It was specific. It had particular places where particular things caused particular trouble, and once you knew them, you managed them, and once nobody told you them, you found out the hard way. Now the letters. Men write home. In that war, with mail moving reliably and with a year to fill, they wrote enormous quantities of it, and what they wrote was frequently a great deal more direct than what any of them would have said to an officer. And in 1967, letters began arriving in American homes that said, in plain language, that the rifle did not work. Marines wrote to parents. Parents wrote to congressmen. Some of those letters were reproduced in newspapers. Some of them were read aloud in Washington, and the specific detail that ran through them over and over in different handwriting from different provinces was the same. It jams, and when it jams, we cannot clear it, and men have been in trouble because of it. A letter home from a young Marine is not a technical document. It is not a test report, and it does not know anything about ball propellant or chamber plating. It is, however, extremely difficult to ignore when there are hundreds of them saying the same thing. There is a specific detail from this period that I am going to handle carefully, because it is the emotional center of the whole controversy, and because it is the kind of claim that gets exaggerated in retelling. Accounts and testimony from that period describe American dead being found with their rifles disassembled beside them in the middle of a fight, in the act of trying to clear a jam. I am going to leave the sentence exactly there. I am not going to add a number to it, or a place, or a name, because the versions of this that circulate with those details attached are frequently not traceable to anything, and because the plain version is already as heavy as anything needs to be. What matters for our purposes is that this image reached Washington in 1967 in letters from the people whose sons were carrying the rifle, and Washington reacted. Now we come to the committee, and I want to slow down here because the committee is the part of this story that almost nobody knows, and it is by far the most interesting. In 1967, the House Armed Services Committee established a special subcommittee to investigate the rifle. It was chaired by a congressman from Missouri named Richard Icord, and the body is generally referred to by his name. What that subcommittee did was not a hearing in the theatrical sense. It was an investigation. It took testimony from soldiers and from Marines who had used the weapon in combat, from officers, from ordnance officials, from the manufacturer, and from the designer himself. It examined the procurement decisions, it looked at the ammunition, it looked at the testing, and its report, published in the autumn of that year, was among the more scathing documents one branch of the United States government has ever produced about another. I will not attempt to quote it, because I do not have the text in front of me, and a fabricated quotation from a real document is exactly the kind of thing that ruins a channel. What I can tell you, because it is the well-established substance of the findings, is the shape of what it concluded. It found that the rifle itself was a fundamentally sound design. It found that the decision to field it without adequate testing of the ammunition it would actually be issued with was a serious error. It found that the change in propellant had contributed materially to the malfunctions. It found that the absence of chrome plating in the chamber had contributed materially to the malfunctions. It found that the failure to supply cleaning equipment and adequate training material was inexcusable. And it directed extremely pointed criticism at the Army's handling of the entire program. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely unusual. A legislative body investigated a weapons program in the middle of a war, took evidence from the young men actually carrying the weapon, and concluded that they had been let down by their own procurement system. Then it published that conclusion in public while the war was still going on. Whatever else you think about any of the institutions in this story, that happened. And it happened because a number of 19-year-olds wrote letters to their mothers. The fixes followed, and they were not exotic. The chamber was chrome-plated. Then the bore as well. That single change addressed the corrosion problem in the humid climate directly, and it is the fix that veterans of the later years describe as having made the most obvious difference. The buffer was redesigned, heavier, to bring the cycle rate back down toward what the design had assumed. Cleaning kits were issued properly in the numbers required with the rifle rather than eventually. The propellant specification was revisited, and the ammunition was brought back into a condition the mechanism could live with, and the training material was rebuilt from nothing, which brings us to one of the most charming objects to come out of any war. Somebody in the Army worked out that the standard technical manual was not doing the job. Technical manuals of that era were dense, gray, badly printed documents written in the passive voice by people who did not much care whether anybody read them. A tired 19-year-old was not going to read one, and if he did, he was not going to remember it. So they made a comic book, a properly illustrated, brightly colored, comic format maintenance manual with a recurring character, written in plain conversational language, with jokes in it, telling the man exactly what to do to keep his rifle running and exactly what would happen if he did not. The artwork is associated with a legendary figure in American comics, and the tone of it is completely unlike anything else the Army printed in that decade. It talks to the reader. It teases him. It uses a cartoon woman to hold the reader's attention on a page about cleaning a chamber, which is a decision of its time, and which was, in the crude terms of whether men read the thing, effective. I find this genuinely wonderful, and not only because it worked, because think about what it represents. An enormous institution having been publicly humiliated by a congressional committee over a failure of communication with its own soldiers, sat down and asked a serious question. Why are they not reading what we send them? And instead of concluding that the soldiers were the problem, which is the answer institutions almost always reach for, it concluded that the writing was the problem. Then it went and hired a comic artist. That manual is still remembered by the men who received it. Ask a veteran of the later years of that war about the comic book, and a surprising number of them will smile and tell you they read it cover to cover, which is more than anyone can say for any technical manual ever printed. Now, let us go back into the machine, because there are two more mechanical arguments in this story, and both of them are interesting. The first is the forward assist. If you look at an M16A1, the version that most people picture, there is a small ribbed plunger on the right side of the receiver behind the ejection port. Pressing it drives the bolt carrier forward. Its purpose is to force the bolt into battery when it has not fully closed on its own. That part was not in Stoner's design. He did not want it. The Air Force did not want it either. The Army insisted. The argument against it is the purist's argument, and it is a good one. If the bolt will not close, something is wrong, and forcing it closed with a plunger does not fix whatever is wrong. It may make it worse by driving around into a chamber that is fouled or into a case that is already stuck. Better to eject the round and start again. The argument for it is the practical soldier's argument, and it is also a good one. There are situations, particularly when a man has ridden the charging handle forward quietly rather than letting it slam, where the bolt is a fraction short of closed and a firm push will seat it. In those situations, a man who cannot fire because his bolt is a millimeter out is a man with a very expensive stick. Both sides were right, in the way that engineering arguments usually have both sides right about different scenarios. The Army got its way, the part was added, and it is still there today, decades later, on rifles descended from that design, which tells you which argument the institution has continued to find persuasive. The second mechanical argument is the magazine. The rifle was fielded with a 20-round aluminum magazine. Magazines are the most commonly overlooked component in any self-loading weapon, and they cause more stoppages across the whole history of firearms than any other single part. An aluminum magazine is light, which is the point. It also dents, and a dented magazine feeds badly. And in a war fought by men crawling and diving onto hard ground with magazines strapped all over their bodies, magazines got dented constantly. The spring inside has to lift a column of cartridges against the pull of the bolt, stripping them off the top. When the magazine is completely full, that spring is at maximum compression, which is the condition in which it is least happy over long periods, which is why the men loaded 18. They arrived at that independently in different units and passed it around, and it became universal practice long before anybody official said anything about it. Later, larger magazines arrived and became the standard, and the material and design of magazines improved a great deal over the following decades. But in the years we are talking about, a man in the field had a light aluminum box, slightly dented, that he had deliberately underloaded because he trusted the spring more than he trusted the specification. That is what it looks like when the people using a system have worked out where its limits are and have quietly built their own margins into it, without permission, in a way that never appears in any document. Armies run on that. All of them. Always have. Let us take another slow breath here, and then we will look at the accusation that hangs over this whole story. Because there is a version of everything I have just told you that circulates widely, and it goes like this. The Army sabotaged the rifle deliberately because the establishment did not want an outsider's design to succeed, and men died to prove a bureaucratic point. I want to take that seriously for a moment rather than dismiss it, because it is emotionally satisfying and because there are real facts underneath it that give it its power. It is true that the institution resisted the design. It is true that a comparative test process was later criticized as not having been even-handed. It is true that the propellant change came from within the ordnance establishment, and that it was the single most damaging decision in the whole sequence. It is true that men suffered and died as a result of a set of decisions made by people who were never in any danger themselves. Every one of those things is true, and if you put them in a row and squint, they form a shape that looks like intent. But look at what the sabotage theory actually requires. It requires that a large number of people in different organizations with different responsibilities coordinated a scheme to degrade a weapon in wartime, and that not one of them broke ranks about it during a congressional investigation that took testimony under oath, and that no document surfaced in the decades since. And it requires you to ignore the far more ordinary explanation which fits every fact without requiring anybody to be a monster, which is this: a propellant was substituted because it could be produced in the quantities the war required. The people who made that decision were solving a production problem and were not the same people who understood the gas system's tuning. The chrome plating was omitted because it cost money, and because nobody had modeled that climate against that steel. The cleaning kits were short because the fielding schedule outran the logistics. The manual was inadequate because the doctrine apparatus had never been built for a rifle that entered service through a side door. And the phrase self-cleaning survived because nobody ever formally killed it, not one villain. 6 ordinary decisions made by 6 different offices, each of them defensible in the room where it was made. That is how nearly every disaster inside a large organization actually happens, and it is much more frightening than a conspiracy, because you cannot fire your way out of it. I am not asking you to feel sympathy for the officers. I am telling you what the evidence supports, because that is the deal this channel makes with you. The rifle was not sabotaged. It was rushed, unmodeled, undertrained, and undersupplied by a system that had every reason to know better and was moving too fast to check. The men paid for that. The report said so in public at the time. Now let us go back and look at the cartridge, because we have been talking all night about a rifle, and we have barely looked at the small brass object it was built around. The round is a 5.56 by 45 millimeter cartridge, and the thing that defines it is not its size, it is its speed. A bullet of that diameter, weighing very little, leaves the barrel at somewhere in the region of 3,000 feet per second. That is a great deal faster than the heavy round it replaced, which trades its speed for mass. Two ways to deliver energy, one heavy and slower, one light and much faster. The mathematics of kinetic energy favored the fast one more than most people expect, because velocity is squared in that equation and mass is not. What that means at the receiving end is a subject I am going to treat clinically, rather than luridly, because this is a program for going to sleep, and because the Internet has quite enough graphic discussion of terminal ballistics already. The short version is that a small, fast projectile behaves differently in tissue from a large, slow one, and the specifics of that behavior depend enormously on velocity, on distance, on what it strikes, and on the design of the bullet. A great deal of confident writing on this topic is not well-founded, and I am not going to add to it. What I will tell you is the argument that was being had at the time, because that argument is the reason the rifle existed at all. The Ordnance Establishment's position was that a full-power cartridge was necessary, that reach and penetration mattered, and that a small round was a step backward in effectiveness. The other position was that in the actual fights, the actual infantry were actually having, at short range, in vegetation, effectiveness came from the number of rounds a man could carry, and the number he could put on target in the first seconds, and that the heavy rounds' advantages were being paid for in a currency the infantryman could not afford. That argument has never fully ended. It is still going on today, 60 years later, in professional journals and on the Internet, and every few years an army somewhere revisits it and comes to a slightly different conclusion, which tells you it was a genuine engineering trade-off and not a matter of one side being stupid. There is a second, more technical argument attached to the cartridge, and it is one of my favorites in the whole subject because it turns on a number almost nobody outside the field has heard of: the twist rate. The inside of a rifle barrel is cut with spiral grooves that spin the bullet as it travels, and that spin is what keeps it point forward in flight rather than tumbling. The rate of that spiral is expressed as the distance the bullet travels down the barrel in one complete rotation. One turn in 12 inches, one turn in 14, one in 7. Get it right, and the bullet flies straight and stable. Too slow a twist, and the bullet does not get enough spin to stay stable, and accuracy falls apart. Too fast a twist, and you are overstabilizing, which costs you a little, and which in extreme cases can affect the bullet's behavior at the far end. The original barrels for this design used a slower twist, and that choice was made based on testing in ordinary conditions. Then somebody tested it in the cold. Air density changes with temperature. Cold air is denser. A bullet that is marginally stable in warm air can become unstable in very cold air, and in Arctic condition, Testing the rounds were found to be losing stability and accuracy. So the twist rate was changed to a faster one to guarantee stability across the whole range of conditions the rifle might be used in. Now hold both halves of that in your head, because the result is one of the quiet ironies of the story. A rifle destined for one of the hottest, wettest places on the planet had its barrel specification altered because of test results obtained in extreme cold, in a country that had a global set of commitments and could not build a rifle for one climate. That is not a mistake. It is the correct decision for a general-issue weapon. But it is a small illustration of a theme that runs through this entire subject, which is that every specification is a compromise between the war you are in and the war you might be in. Let us go and stand next to a man cleaning one of these, because this is the part of the story that happened most often and gets described least. It is late afternoon. The unit has stopped. The perimeter is out, and the holes are dug, and there is a stretch of an hour before the light goes. He sits on his helmet with a poncho spread on his knees so that nothing small can be lost in the mud, which is a lesson everybody learns exactly once. He pushes out the 2 pins that hold the rifle together, and it hinges open, and then comes apart into 2 halves, which is a thing this design does beautifully, and which almost no rifle before it did. He pulls the charging handle back, and the bolt carrier group slides out into his hand. Now, the small parts, the firing pin drops out when you pull its retaining pin. The bolt comes out of the carrier when you rotate the cam pin, and the cam pin will not come out until the bolt is in the right position, which is one of those design details that is elegant on a bench and infuriating in the dark with cold hands. He looks at the bolt. There is a black deposit on it. There is a black deposit inside the carrier and around the gas rings and in the recesses behind the bolt lugs. He cleans it with a rag and a brush and whatever solvent exists, and pays particular attention to the places where the carbon builds hardest, because he has learned by now exactly where those are, and nobody had to write it down for him. He runs a rod down the bore. He looks at the chamber, because he has learned to look at the chamber, and because on a rifle without the plating, a chamber can start going wrong in a way you can see if you know what you are looking at. He wipes everything with a very light film of oil, because too much oil in that environment collects dust and turns into a paste that is worse than nothing, which is another thing nobody wrote down and everybody knew. He puts it back together in reverse order. He checks the function. He loads a magazine, 18 rounds, and lays the rifle beside him where his hand will find it in the dark without looking. 15 minutes, maybe 20, every day, or as close to every day as the war allowed, for a year. That is the actual answer to this entire story. Not the committee, not the chrome, not the buffer. A tired young man, on a helmet with a poncho on his knees, doing a small, careful job with his hands in the last of the light. And the reason I wanted you to sit through that in detail is this. Every complaint in this whole subject is about a rifle that demanded that ritual. Every fix that eventually came was aimed at making the ritual less punishing. But the ritual never went away, and it has not gone away in the 60 years since, and any man who has carried a descendant of this rifle in any army in any decade since will recognize every step of what I have just described. There is a detail about the fixes that I skipped, and it is the most human part of the engineering. When the chrome plating went in, it did not go into every rifle at once. It could not. There were hundreds of thousands of weapons already in the field, and you cannot recall an army's rifles the way a manufacturer recalls a car. So, for a period, there were two populations in service at the same time: rifles with the treated chamber and rifles without, rifles with the new buffer and rifles with the old one, in the same company, sometimes in the same squad, which produced a small, unofficial economy of exactly the kind soldiers always produce. Men who knew what to look for could tell the difference, and men who could tell the difference had a preference, and preferences among soldiers become trades. A rifle that came back from an armorer with the newer parts did not stay unclaimed for long. The senior men got them first, in most units, which is the ordinary law of every army since the invention of the spear. Then the men who had been there the longest, then everybody else as the supply caught up, which it eventually did. And the men who received the good ones knew perfectly well why they were good, because by then the whole army knew, and the knowledge that had once been passed around as rumor had become simply what everybody understood. That is the last stage of any equipment problem. Not the fix arriving, the fix becoming ordinary, until nobody remembers there was a problem, until a man who arrives 2 years later carries a rifle that works and has no idea that anything ever did not. Now let us give the other side of the story its time, because so far tonight we have mostly been describing what went wrong, and there is a whole population of men from that war who will tell you, quite firmly, that they liked it. The men who were issued the rifle in the later years of the war, after the fixes, do not tell the story we have been telling. Ask them, and you will very often get a shrug and a comment that it was light, and it shot straight, and it did what it was told. Even in the bad years, there were units that had very little trouble, and the reasons they had little trouble are exactly the reasons you would predict. They had cleaning equipment, they had a leader who enforced maintenance, and they had ammunition from a lot that happened to behave. And there were things about the design that men loved from the very beginning, and that the controversy tends to bury. It was light, not slightly lighter, transformatively lighter, in a war where every man was already carrying more than he should. It was short, and it handled in dense vegetation in a way the long rifle simply could not. It was accurate, genuinely accurate, in a way that made an ordinarily trained man better than he had any right to be, because the recoil was so mild that he did not flinch, and because the sights were good. It was easy to teach. A man could be brought to a usable standard on it in far less time than on the older rifle, which matters enormously in an army that is expanding fast and training people quickly. And it could be fired on automatic and actually controlled, which was the thing the M14 could never do. I want to be careful not to let the drama of the malfunction story erase all of that, because the men who carried it deserve an accurate account, and because the design's own subsequent history settles the argument fairly conclusively. There is one more group whose view is worth having, and it is the unit armorer. Every unit had somebody responsible for the weapons. He was not usually a specialist in the grand sense. He was a soldier with a bit of training and a set of tools and a supply of spare parts, working out of a tent or a bunker or a Conex box. His view of this rifle was the most practical view anybody had, because he saw all of them, not just his own. And what he saw was that the failures clustered. Certain small parts wore or broke more than others, and he learned which ones, and he kept those in his pocket. The extractor spring, which is the small spring behind the claw that grips the case rim. When it weakens, extraction gets marginal, and marginal extraction in a rifle already fighting the chamber is the beginning of the whole cascade we described earlier. The gas rings on the bolt, which are three small split rings that seal the gas inside the carrier, they wear. When they are worn past a certain point, the rifle loses some of the push that drives the cycle, and it starts short-stroking, which means it does not travel far enough back to pick up the next round properly. Firing pins, which are thin and long in this design and which can break. Magazine springs and magazine feed lips, which is where most stoppages in most weapons come from, and which almost nobody thinks about. An armorer who knew his rifles and had those parts on hand could keep a company running through conditions that would otherwise have produced a steady trickle of complaints. An armorer without the parts could do nothing at all, which brings us to a very unglamorous point that runs underneath the whole story. The performance of a weapon in the field is not a property of the weapon. It is a property of the whole system, the design, the ammunition, the maintenance training, the cleaning equipment, the spare parts pipeline, and the sergeant who checks. Change any one of those, and the same rifle becomes a different rifle. In 1968, the design was good, and every other part of that system was broken. By 1969, the design was slightly better, and every other part of the system had been fixed. Same rifle, roughly. Completely different reputation. There is one more technical idea I want to give you tonight, and then we will start heading toward the end. It is called tolerance stacking, and once you know about it, you will see it everywhere for the rest of your life. Every part that is manufactured has a specification and an allowable variation. A hole must be a certain diameter, plus or minus a small amount. A spring must produce a certain force, plus or minus. A chamber must be a certain size, within limits. Any single part that is at the far edge of its allowable range is still formally correct. It passed inspection. It is in spec. Now assemble 20 parts, each of which happens to be at the unfavorable edge of its own range. Every one of them is in spec. The assembly does not work. That is tolerance stacking, and it is one of the most common reasons a design that performs beautifully in the prototype shop develops mysterious problems once it is being produced by the 100,000 across multiple factories. Now add to that a change in ammunition behavior, and a chamber surface degrading in the climate, and a maintenance regime that has not been taught, and you can see how two rifles from the same crate, in the hands of two men in the same platoon, could behave differently. One man's rifle ran all year. The man beside him had trouble constantly. Both of them were telling the truth. Neither of them could explain it, and both of them formed a permanent opinion about the weapon based on their own experience, and those opinions are still being argued about at reunions. That is not a mystery. It is arithmetic. There is a companion story to all of this that deserves a few minutes because it explains why the men trusted their own hands more than any specification, and because it is very quiet and very ordinary. Every rifle in that war developed a personality. That is not romance. It is manufacturing variation, which we have already discussed, expressed through months of daily contact with one specific object. A man who carried the same weapon for a year knew things about it that appear on no document. He knew that his particular rifle liked to be a little wetter with oil than the book suggested, or a little drier. He knew that the third magazine in his pouch was the one that had been dropped on a rock in April, and that it fed slightly less reliably than the others, so he put it last. He knew the exact sound his own bolt made when it closed properly, and the slightly different sound when it did not, and could hear the difference in the dark. He knew where his rifle shot in relation to where he aimed, at the ranges he actually fired at, and had adjusted his hold accordingly without touching the sights. None of that transfers. When he went home, another man was handed that rifle and had to learn all of it again from nothing. There is something in that which is true of every tool and every trade. A carpenter's plane, a cook's knife. The relationship between a person and an object they use every day for a year is not a relationship with a specification. It is a relationship with one particular thing, with its particular faults, learned by hand. The men who were let down in the bad years were not let down by an abstraction. They were let down by an object they had been carrying and cleaning and looking after personally every day, which is why the feeling lasted. And the men who came later, who had the plated chamber and the kit and the comic book, developed exactly the same relationship with an object that held up its end. Same design, different deal. Let us come back up to the human level, because we have been down in the machine for a long while. There is a particular kind of anger that shows up in veterans' accounts of this subject, and it is worth understanding what the anger is actually about, because it is frequently misread. It is not really anger about a mechanical failure. Soldiers understand that equipment breaks. Every one of them had a radio fail, a vehicle fail, a piece of gear fall apart. The anger is about having been told something that was not true, by an institution they had no choice but to trust, about the one object they were required to trust most. And it is about the specific insult of the phrase, self-cleaning. A young man carrying a rifle that jams, who has been told he would not need to clean it much, and who then hears an officer suggest that the problem is that he has not been cleaning it enough. That is the wound, not the jam, the being blamed for the jam. You can hear it in the way they tell it. The technical details get slightly different each time, and the numbers drift, the way numbers do after 50 years. But that part never drifts. Now, I want to give you one more scene, and this one is at the other end of the story. It is 1969 or 1970. A different young man, in a different province, has just been issued a rifle. It has a chrome-lined chamber and bore. It came with a cleaning kit. Somebody handed him a comic book that told him, in language he actually read, what to do with it and what would happen if he did not. His sergeant checks his rifle and does it in a way that suggests the sergeant has personal experience of what happens when nobody checks. He will carry that rifle for a year, clean it in the last of the light most days, load 18 rounds because the older men told him to, and come home with an entirely ordinary opinion of it. Nobody will interview him. His experience will not generate any letters to Congress. There is no story in a rifle that works. And that is the actual ending of this, which is why almost nobody knows it. The system was publicly embarrassed, went away, fixed 6 specific things, and produced a weapon that then served, in one form or another, for longer than any other rifle in the history of the United States military. The fix is boring. The fix is always boring. That is why the failure is the only part anybody remembers. Let us spend a little time on what the thing is actually made of, because we have talked about how it behaves and never about its substance, and because the materials are half the reason it exists. The receiver, which is the body of the rifle, is aluminum alloy. Specifically, it is a forged aluminum, which is not the same thing as cast, and the difference matters. Forging aligns the internal grain structure of the metal along the shape of the part, which makes it stronger for its weight than the same alloy poured into a mold. Then it is anodized, which is an electrochemical process that grows a hard oxide layer on the surface of the aluminum. That layer is what gives the rifle its characteristic matte black finish. And it is not paint. It is the metal's own surface, converted. It resists corrosion and wear far better than bare aluminum, which would otherwise scuff and oxidize almost immediately. The barrel is steel because a barrel has to be steel. Nothing else survives the pressures and the heat. The furniture, which is the word for the parts you hold, is a synthetic. In the original rifles, it was a glass-reinforced plastic, and it was the single most mocked feature of the entire design in its early years. Men called it the plastic rifle, the toy, the Mattel gun, after the toy company, which is a joke that has been repeated so many times over 60 years that a great many people now believe the toy company actually made parts for it. It did not, as far as any documentation shows. That mockery is worth sitting with for a second, because it is a small piece of cultural history. An entire generation of men had been raised to associate a serious weapon with wood and steel. Weight signaled quality. Wood signaled craft. A rifle you could feel in your shoulders when you carried it was a rifle that meant business. And here comes an object made of aircraft alloy and plastic, weighing almost nothing, that looked to them like something a child would find under a tree at Christmas. The instinct is not stupid. It is exactly the instinct that has made people distrust every new material in every field for the whole of industrial history. It was wrong here, but it was wrong for understandable reasons, and the men who held that view were not fools. They were applying a lifetime of correct experience to a case where it did not apply. 60 years later, the plastic and aluminum rifle is what almost every army on Earth carries, in one variation or another, and nobody thinks about it at all. Before the sound of it firing, there are the small sounds of handling it, and these are the ones that a man who carried one for a year can still produce from memory on request, the magazine going in. A firm push until the catch takes it, and then a small tug downward to confirm it is seated, because a magazine that is nearly in is the most common cause of the first round not feeding in any rifle ever made. That tug became automatic. Men still do it decades later with anything that clicks into anything. The bolt going forward. Pull the charging handle back and let go. And the spring drives everything home with a metallic slam that is unmistakable and that carries further at night than anybody would like. Which is why the alternative existed, riding the handle forward with your palm, slowly, quietly, when noise mattered. That was the technique that occasionally left the bolt a fraction short of closed, which is the situation the forward assist was added for. The two facts are connected, and now you know why that little plunger is on the side of the rifle, the safety selector. A short rotation with the thumb, from safe to semi-automatic to automatic, with a distinct click at each position, positioned exactly where the right thumb sits without moving the hand. That click is the one that shows up most often in veterans' descriptions of a night contact. Not the shooting. The sound of a dozen thumbs moving a dozen selectors at the same moment all around a perimeter in the dark when something has been heard. The dust cover snapping closed. The two pins pushed out with the tip of a cartridge because there is a small recess in the base of a cartridge that fits them perfectly, which is one of those details that was never designed and that every soldier discovered. And the sound of the sling swivel, which is small and metallic, and which everybody in that country learned to tape or to muffle, because a man walking in the dark with a loose swivel announces himself for 50 meters and is told about it once. None of those sounds appear in a manual, all of them lived in the hands of a few 100,000 young men for a year each, and a great many of those hands could still perform every one of them today without looking. Now the sound of it firing, because this is a detail that every veteran mentions and that almost never appears in written accounts. The rifle has a distinctive report, a sharp, high, cracking sound, quite different from the deeper boom of the heavier rifles that came before it, and completely different from the sound of the weapon the other side was carrying. That difference was not a curiosity. It was tactical information, delivered instantly, at any hour, in any visibility. In a night contact, in vegetation, where nobody can see anything, the sound of the shooting tells you who is shooting. The men learned both signatures within their first weeks, and could separate them without thinking about it for the rest of their lives. That is one of the things veterans describe as never going away. A car backfiring at the wrong angle, a film with the sound mixed accurately. 50 years later, and the part of the brain that catalogued those two sounds is still on duty, and has never once been stood down. There is something in that which belongs in a program about sleep, so let me say it gently, and then move on. A great many of the things this war put into those men were not memories in the ordinary sense. They were reflexes, trained responses installed by repetition under stress, at an age when the nervous system installs things permanently, shaking out a boot, waking fully at a small sound, identifying a rifle by its report. None of those things ever ask permission before appearing. Now let us follow the design out of the war, because what happened next settles the argument. The rifle went through a series of improvements over the following decades. The version most people picture from the war, with the forward assist and the triangular handguards, gave way to later variants with different sights, different furniture, different barrel profiles, different twist rates, a heavier barrel, and eventually a 3-round burst mechanism in place of full automatic. The pattern spread. Shorter carbine versions, specialist variants, marksman versions with heavier barrels, and an enormous ecosystem of civilian rifles built on the same architecture, which is a whole separate subject with its own arguments that we are not going into tonight. The design has now been in continuous service, in one form or another, for longer than any other rifle in American history. That is not a small claim, and it is not a matter of opinion. It is simply arithmetic against the calendar, and the small, fast cartridge, which the ordnance establishment had insisted was inadequate, was adopted as a standard by the alliance that America belonged to, and then by a very large part of the rest of the world. Nearly every modern military rifle you can name is chambered for a cartridge of that general philosophy. The argument, in other words, was settled in favor of the outsider from the aircraft company, comprehensively, by everybody. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the one I find most interesting in the entire subject. If the design was right, and the cartridge was right, and the whole world eventually agreed, then what exactly failed in 1966? And the answer is the part nobody wants, because it is not about a rifle at all. What failed was the interface between a good design and a large organization in a hurry. The design was tested by people who understood it, and then handed to a system that did not. The system made a series of substitutions, each one rational within its own department, none of them modeled against the whole. Nobody owned the integration. There was no single person whose job was to say, if we change the powder, what happens to the timing? That job existed nowhere. That is the failure. And that failure is not a historical curiosity. It is the single most common way complex systems fail, in every industry, in every decade, right now, today. A component is substituted for a good local reason. The consequence appears somewhere else entirely, in a different department, weeks or months later, to somebody who does not know the substitution happened. Aviation has spent 70 years building a culture specifically designed to prevent that. Medicine is still working on it. Software rediscovers it every few years and gives it a new name. In 1966, it happened to a rifle, and the place where the consequence appeared was a tree line, and the person who found out was 19. Let me tell you what happened to the designer, because it is a good ending for his part of it. Eugene Stoner went on working. He designed other weapons, some of them successful and some of them not, and he spent decades as one of the most respected figures in the field. And he lived long enough to see his design vindicated completely, to see it become the standard rifle of his own country's military, to see its architecture copied and adapted all over the world, to see the small, fast cartridge he had been told was inadequate become the standard of the alliance. There is a story that circulates about him and about the designer of the rifle on the other side, that the two of them met in later life and got on well and had a great deal to say to each other. I have seen that account repeated in a number of places, and I am not going to build anything on it beyond mentioning that the story exists, because it is the kind of pleasing anecdote that gets better every time it is told, and I do not have the documentation in front of me. What is solidly documented is the outcome. He was right. It took a while, and other people's decisions nearly buried it, and he was right. One more thread to close, which is what the other side made of it. Captured American rifles were used by the other side throughout that war, as captured weapons always are. They were valued for the same reasons the Americans valued them, which is that they were light and accurate and easy to shoot. They were also, from the perspective of an army with no supply system for them, a problem. No spare parts, no magazines beyond what was captured with them, no cleaning equipment designed for them, and ammunition that could only come from capture in a caliber nothing else on their side used. So, a captured rifle was a prize with an expiry date, and the men who used them knew it. There is a quiet symmetry in that which I like. The weapon whose central weakness was that it depended on a system to support it was, in the hands of people with no system at all, exactly as good as its last magazine and its last clean. Both sides learned the same lesson about the same object from opposite directions, and the older rifle, the heavy one that was supposed to be finished, did not go away either. It came back, in a specialized role, where the fight was at long range, in open country, and where a man with training was picking specific targets at distance. The qualities that had made the M14 the wrong general-issue rifle made it exactly right. Versions of it served for decades afterward in that role, in that war and in later ones, in the hands of designated marksmen, which is the tidiest possible illustration of the point we have been circling all night. There is no such thing as the best rifle. There is only the best rifle for a specified job, and the moment you change the job, the answer changes with it. There is a question I have been putting off all night, and we should deal with it before the committee because it is the one everybody asks. Why did nobody test the rifle with the ammunition it would actually be issued? It sounds like the most obvious thing in the world. You have a weapon. You have a cartridge. You put one in the other in quantity, in conditions resembling where it is going, and you count the stoppages. And the honest answer is that, in a sense, testing did happen. There was a great deal of testing in that whole program, over years, of various kinds. What did not happen was the specific test at the specific moment with the specific combination after the substitution in that climate, which sounds like an excuse and is actually the entire lesson. Large organizations do not fail to test, they test constantly. What they fail to do is retest after a change, when the change was made in a different department for a different reason by people who did not know that anybody downstream had built assumptions on the thing they altered. The propellant people were not being negligent by their own standards. Their job was to produce a cartridge that met the cartridge specification, and the ball propellant loading met the cartridge specification. Velocity within tolerance, pressure within tolerance, accuracy acceptable. By every number they were responsible for, they had done their job correctly. The problem is that the cartridge specification did not include a line for how much residue the propellant leaves in a direct impingement gas system, or what it does to the cyclic rate of one particular rifle. Nobody had written that line, because when the specification was drafted, nobody had imagined that the propellant type would be treated as interchangeable. An unwritten assumption is the most dangerous object in any engineering organization. It cannot be checked because it is not on any list. It cannot be defended because nobody knows it is there. And it is discovered only at the moment it is violated, usually by somebody who had no idea it existed. Stoner knew about that assumption. It lived in his head, and in the heads of the small group who had built the thing, and by the time the substitution was made, the design had traveled a long way from that small group through a purchase by one service and an adoption by another and a production contract and a fielding program, and the assumption had not traveled with it. That is how knowledge is lost inside institutions, not by being forgotten, by being left behind when the object moves and the people do not. I want to go back to the committee for a while because I skipped over the most interesting thing about it. They brought the men in, not only officials, not only officers, Marines and soldiers who had carried the rifle in contact, brought back and put in a room in Washington and asked directly what happened. Think about the distance that represents. A young man who 3 months earlier had been lying in vegetation with a jammed rifle is now sitting at a table in a hearing room in a suit that probably is not his, being asked by a congressman to describe in detail what the weapon did. There is no version of that which is comfortable for anybody in the room, and the value of it is enormous because there is no substitute for it. An ordnance official can tell a committee what the specification says. A manufacturer can tell them what the test showed. Only the man who was there can say what the object did in his hands on the day, and only he can be asked follow-up questions about it. That is why the report landed the way it did. It was not built on theory. It was built on testimony from the far end of the chain. The press picked it up, and the story ran. And for a period in 1967, the American public was reading about a rifle. That is worth pausing on, too. In the middle of an enormously controversial war, with everything else that was in the news that year, a technical story about propellant chemistry and chamber plating broke through and became a national argument. It broke through because of the letters. A technical story does not travel. A mother reading her son's handwriting does, and once it was public, the institution had no way to manage it slowly, which is very probably the only reason it moved fast. I have gone back and forth about how much to make of that, and here is where I have landed. It is not a heroic story, and I am not going to dress it up as one. Men were let down for a year and a half before anybody with authority took it seriously, and the reason it was eventually taken seriously was embarrassment rather than diligence. But it was taken seriously. The report was published rather than buried. The fixes were funded and fielded, and a great many men who arrived in 1969 and 1970 carried a weapon that worked, and never knew that they had the men of 1966 to thank for it, and the mothers who mailed the cleaning kits, and a congressman from Missouri. That is how most improvements in most institutions actually happen. Somebody at the bottom pays for a lesson, and somebody they will never meet gets the benefit. There is one more group in this story that almost never gets mentioned, and they deserve a few minutes: the South Vietnamese soldier. For years, the American advisors had been arguing for exactly this rifle for their allies, and the argument was physical. The average Vietnamese soldier of that period was smaller and lighter than the average American, and the M16, and before it, the older American rifles, were simply too much weapon. Too long for his reach, too heavy for his frame, recoil out of proportion to his mass. A man fighting with a rifle that does not fit him is at a disadvantage that has nothing to do with courage or training. The light rifle with the small cartridge fitted. It fitted well. The reports from the advisors who saw it in those hands were consistently enthusiastic, and those reports were part of the pressure that eventually moved the whole decision. But the Allied forces did not receive it first. They received it well after the Americans did, in the general re-equipment of the later years, which meant that for a period they were fighting alongside an army, carrying one weapon while they carried another, older, heavier one, and when they did receive it, they received it into a support system that was thinner than the American one. Fewer spare parts, less depth in maintenance training, which means everything we discussed tonight about the rifle being only as good as the system around it applied to them with the volume turned up. I am not going to draw a conclusion from that. I only want the account to include them, because they carried the same object in the same climate, and their part of the story is almost never told in English. Now, let me put you somewhere for a moment, and then we will move on. You are a mother in a small town in the United States. It is the spring of 1967. There is a letter on the kitchen table from your son, who is 19, and who has never in his life written to you about anything mechanical. The letter is mostly what his letters always are. He is fine. The food is bad. He asks about the dog. And then, in the middle of it, in the same handwriting, there is a paragraph about his rifle. He says it jams. He says it jammed on him. He says 2 other men in his platoon had the same thing happen in the same week. He asks, in the flat way that young men ask for things when they do not want to worry anybody, whether you could send him a cleaning rod and a bore brush and some solvent, because they have not been issued any, and the ones they have are being shared around. You read that paragraph several times. Then you go to the hardware store in town, and you buy a gun cleaning kit, and you take it home, and you pack it in a box with cookies and socks, and you carry it to the post office. And then, because you are not a person who lets a thing go, you sit down and write to your congressman. That happened, not once. Enough times that it changed the outcome. If you want to know what actually fixed the rifle, that is the answer. Not the engineering. The engineering was easy, once somebody was made to look. What fixed the rifle was a large number of ordinary people at the bottom of a very large structure, refusing to accept the explanation they had been given. Before we finish with the machine, there are 3 or 4 smaller rooms in this house that we have walked past, and I would like to open the doors, because each of them explains something. The first is where the ammunition actually came from. We have talked about the propellant change as if it were a single decision made by a single office, which is a useful simplification, and not quite the truth. Cartridges for that war were produced in enormous quantity by several different plants, and ammunition is manufactured in lots. And a lot is a batch made at one facility over a defined period from defined components. Each lot has an identifying code stamped on the packaging, and to almost everybody handling it, that code is invisible bureaucracy. To anybody trying to work out why a rifle is misbehaving, that code is everything, because two lots that both meet specification can behave measurably differently. Slightly different pressure curves, slightly different fouling characteristics, slightly different port pressure at the moment that matters, which means that a unit issued ammunition from one lot might have a perfectly ordinary month, and a unit down the road issued a different lot might have a run of stoppages, and neither of them would ever know why, and both would form permanent opinions about the rifle. That is one of the reasons the accounts from that period are so contradictory. Two honest men, two different experiences, and the actual variable was a number on a crate that neither of them ever looked at. Investigating that kind of problem properly requires somebody to correlate malfunction reports against ammunition lot numbers across many units, which is exactly the sort of unglamorous statistical work that nobody wants to fund, and that is the only thing that ever actually solves a problem like this. Eventually, that work was done. It is a large part of why the fixes were the right fixes rather than guesses. The second room is the training pipeline, and this one produced any specific and avoidable misery. For a period during the transition, a young man could go through his basic training in the United States on the older rifle, learn its manual of arms, learn its maintenance, learn to shoot it, qualify with it, and form all of his habits around it, then arrive in country and be handed a different rifle, sometimes with a short familiarization, sometimes with a very short one. Think about what that means at the level of the hands. Every control is in a different place. The magazine release is somewhere else. The safety works differently. The rifle comes apart in a completely different way. The cleaning procedure is different, and the places where fouling collects are different, and everything he had drilled into muscle memory over weeks now applies to an object he is no longer carrying. A soldier under stress reverts to what he trained on. That is not a character flaw, it is neurology, and a man whose hands had learned one rifle and who was carrying another was, in the first weeks, measurably slower at everything, including the thing he most needed to be fast at. The system caught up eventually, and training was rebuilt around the new weapon, as it always is. But there was a window in the middle years where a meaningful number of men experienced exactly that discontinuity. If you want a single sentence that captures the whole of tonight, it might be this one. The rifle arrived before the paperwork, and men live in the gap between those two things. The third room is where a soldier actually received his rifle, which is not where most people imagine. He did not, in most cases, arrive in country carrying the weapon he would use. He came in on an aircraft with a bag. He passed through a replacement center. He was assigned to a unit, and somewhere in that process, a rifle was issued to him out of a rack. That rifle had a history he knew nothing about. It might be nearly new. It might have been carried by 3 men before him. Its bolt might be original, or might have been swapped by an armorer 6 months earlier. Its chamber might be pristine, or might already be pitted. Its extractor spring might be fresh or might be at the end of its life, and he had no way to know any of that, and in most cases no way to test it beyond firing a few rounds if he was lucky enough to be given the chance. A man's opinion of this rifle, formed over a year, was therefore substantially determined by the condition of the specific object he happened to be handed on one particular morning by a clerk who was not thinking about it. That is not how anybody would design a system. It is how every large system that issues equipment to large numbers of people actually works. The fourth room is the rest of the squad, because a rifle does not fight alone, and the story reads differently when you see it in company. A squad in that war carried a mixture, the rifles we have been discussing, a machine gun, belt-fed, firing the older heavy cartridge, which was the squad's real weight of fire, and which was carried by a man everybody looked after because he was carrying 23 pounds of gun before any ammunition. A grenade launcher, a single-shot weapon that broke open like a shotgun and lobbed a small explosive projectile out to a couple of 100 meters, which men called by a nickname derived from the sound it made when fired. And frequently a shotgun, which is a weapon that had no business being modern, and which was completely at home in vegetation at 10 meters, and which appears in accounts of that war far more often than most people expect. The point of listing them is this: the squad's effectiveness came from the combination, not from any single weapon. When the rifles were having their bad year, the machine gun and the grenade launcher were carrying more of the load than the doctrine assumed, and men noticed, and the machine gunner's status inside a squad went up accordingly. Soldiers adjust, they rebalance around whatever is working, and that rebalancing happens instantly and informally, without anybody writing a new doctrine, in every unit, in every war. There is one more small thing I want to give you, because it is such a good example of the difference between a specification and a life. Water in the barrel. If a rifle's bore is obstructed by mud or by water or by anything, firing it is dangerous. A bullet meeting a plug of water in a confined steel tube produces a pressure spike, and the barrel can bulge or worse. In a country where men waded chest-deep through paddies and streams several times a day carrying rifles, that is not a theoretical concern. It is Tuesday. So they covered the muzzles with tape, with a small plastic cap where one was available, and universally and famously with a condom rolled over the end, which is watertight, elastic, free, available in quantity, and which a bullet passes through without any meaningful effect on anything. That improvisation appears in every account of that war. It is one of the most widely repeated details of the whole conflict, and it is a perfect small monument to the theme of tonight. The official answer was a piece of equipment that was not always there, and the field answer was an object that everybody had, that worked completely, and that no manual would ever formally recommend. Which brings me to a thought I want to leave with you before we go back into the mechanism. Everything in this story that actually worked in the bad years came from below. The obsessive cleaning came from the men. The 18-round magazine came from the men. The rod taped to the stock came from the men. The muzzle cover came from the men. The letters that eventually fixed the whole thing came from the men and from their mothers. The institution's contribution, once it finally engaged, was excellent and decisive, and could not have come from anywhere else. Chrome plating a chamber is not something a squad can do in the field, but the institution only engaged because the people at the bottom refused to accept that the problem was them. Let us go back inside the mechanism one last time, slowly, because I want you to see the whole cycle in order. It is a small piece of choreography, and it happens in about 1/100th of a second, and describing it at this hour is exactly the sort of thing that ought to send you off. The trigger releases the hammer. The hammer strikes the back of the firing pin. The firing pin runs forward through a channel in the bolt and strikes the primer at the base of the cartridge. The primer ignites. The propellant burns very fast, and the pressure inside that small brass case rises to something in the region of 50,000 pounds per square inch. The bullet begins to move. It engages the rifling and starts to spin, and it accelerates down the barrel with the gas pushing behind it. Partway along the barrel, there is a small hole drilled through the top, the gas port. As the bullet passes it, a portion of that gas is diverted upward into the gas block and back down the thin steel tube toward the receiver. The bullet leaves the muzzle. That is the noise. Meanwhile, the gas in the tube arrives at the bolt carrier and enters a chamber inside it and expands and pushes the carrier backward against the bolt, which is at that instant locked into the barrel extension by its lugs. The carrier moves a fraction of an inch on its own before it does anything else, and during that fraction, a small pin on the bolt travels along a curved slot in the carrier, and that curve rotates the bolt. That rotation unlocks the lugs. Now the bolt and carrier travel backward together. The extractor claw, hooked over the rim of the case, pulls it out of the chamber. The ejector, a small spring-loaded plunger in the bolt face, pushes the case sideways, and it flies out of the port. The carrier travels back into the buffer tube, compressing the spring, and the buffer moderates that travel. On its way back, it cocks the hammer. Then the spring pushes everything forward again. The bolt face strips the top round out of the magazine, drives it up the feed ramps and into the chamber, and the cam pin runs back down its curved slot and rotates the bolt into lock. The rifle is ready. Total elapsed time, a small fraction of a second. Now, with that sequence in your head, notice where each of tonight's problems lives. The faster cycle from the substituted propellant attacks the moment the bolt begins to unlock, because it starts that rotation slightly earlier while pressure is higher than intended. The fouling attacks the carrier and the gas rings and the recesses of the bolt, because that is where the gas goes. The unplated chamber attacks the extraction, because a corroded chamber grips the case. The tired extractor spring attacks the same instant from the other side, because a weak claw pulling on a stuck case is a claw that will slip. All four failures converge on the same 1/10th of a second in that sequence. That is why they compounded. That is why the rifle did not degrade gracefully, but simply stopped. And that is why the fixes worked so completely. Once somebody finally sat down and looked at the whole cycle at once, instead of at their own department's part of it. There is one more thing worth noticing about that sequence, and it is the reason engineers are fond of this design despite everything we have said tonight. Look at how few parts are actually doing the work. A bolt that rotates on a cam pin, a carrier that acts as its own piston, a spring and a weight in a tube, an extractor claw and a small plunger. That is very nearly the whole story of a mechanism that has to do all of that, in order thousands of times, without being looked at. Compare it to what the same job required in the generation before, with an operating rod running down the side of the barrel, a piston, a separate gas cylinder, and a good deal more metal moving in a good deal more directions. Stoner took parts out. That is the hardest thing to do in engineering, far harder than adding them, And it is the reason his architecture is still in production 60 years later, while almost everything it competed against is in museums. The cost of taking those parts out was that the gas had to go somewhere, and where it went was into the mechanism, and that decision had to be paid for with cleanliness. He knew the price. He designed the rifle, knowing the price. He simply assumed that the people fielding it would also know, and would tell the man carrying it. That assumption is the only real mistake in the entire design, and it was not an engineering mistake at all. Chrome the chamber, and the case releases. Slow the carrier with a heavier buffer, and the unlocking happens when it should. Give the man a brush, and a rod, and a manual he will actually read, and the fouling never accumulates far enough to matter. 4 small changes, 1 rifle transformed. Let us go through the whole thing once more, slowly, the way you count something to fall asleep. A designer at an aircraft company thinking about a rifle the way an engineer thinks about a wing. Aluminum instead of steel, plastic instead of walnut, under 7 pounds instead of over 9. A small, fast cartridge, a third the weight, 3 times as many in the same load. No piston, the gas going straight into the heart of the mechanism, which buys lightness and precision and costs cleanliness, an establishment that did not want it, for reasons that were part expertise and part pride, in proportions nobody will ever fully separate. An Air Force that bought it for guarding gates, so the rifle entered the building through a side door with none of its paperwork. A war that expanded faster than the paperwork could be written. A propellant substituted for entirely sensible production reasons by people in a different building. A cycle that sped up. Fouling that arrived in the worst place. A chamber left unplated to save a step in the wettest air on Earth. A phrase that nobody ever formally killed. Self-cleaning. Cleaning kits that did not arrive. Rods and brushes and solvent mailed from hardware stores in Ohio by families who had read a letter. An extractor claw tearing through a case rim. A spent case wedged in a chamber. A rifle that has become an oddly shaped stick. A cleaning rod taped to a stock, because everybody knew. 18 rounds in a 20-round magazine, because the men trusted the spring more than the specification. Letters home, hundreds of them, in different handwriting, from different provinces saying the same thing. A congressman from Missouri, and a subcommittee, and a report that said out loud, in public, in the middle of a war, that the men had been let down. Chrome in the chamber, a heavier buffer, kits in every hand. And a comic book, of all things, because somebody finally asked why the soldiers were not reading the manual and had the humility to conclude that the manual was the problem. That is the whole story. And now the call back, and then I will let you go. We started tonight with a young man arriving in a country with a brand new rifle and no cleaning kit, because somebody had written that he would not need one. Here is what I want you to take from that. If you take anything, and it is not about rifles, nobody in this story set out to hurt him. Not the designer who built something excellent. Not the ordnance officials who were solving a production problem in a hurry with the tools they had. Not the officers who believed what they had been told. Not the committee which did its job better than anybody had any right to expect. Every single decision in the chain was defensible in the room where it was made, and the sum of all of them, delivered to one place, at one moment, was a 19-year-old lying in vegetation with a rod down the barrel of his rifle, trying to knock out a piece of brass while the noise went on around him. That is what an institution failing actually looks like at the bottom. Not villains, arithmetic, arriving at somebody. They fixed it in the end because those young men wrote letters, and because somebody in Washington read them and took them seriously. That is not nothing. In the whole grim catalogue of that war, it is one of the few chapters where the system was told it was wrong by the people carrying the consequences, and listened and changed. The chamber is plated now. The buffer is heavier. There is a kit in the pouch, and a rod in 3 sections, and a small brush, and a comic book that somebody actually read. And if you are still with me at this hour, do one small thing before you drift off. Tap the like button and subscribe so the next one finds you tomorrow night. And tell me in the comments where you were listening from. If you carried one of these, or your father did, and your experience of it was different from anything I have described, that belongs in the record more than anything I could say. Leave it below. I read them all. Sleep well. I will be here again tomorrow night with something else that takes a long time to say.